Obese virgin birthed 5 children for an infertile mountain man. What happened next shocked everyone. A storm howls through the Colorado mountains, and a lonely mountain man drags home an obese virgin he found half frozen by the road. Folks said she was too plain to be loved, and he was too broken to be a father. But when winter melts, the impossible happens. She's carrying 5 living babies, and the whole town explodes in gossip. Church bells ring, jail keys rattle. The preacher calls it a miracle, but the doctor swears it's a fraud. And when lawmen come to take her children, the mountain turns into a battleground between faith and pride. In a valley divided by rumor and reason, one man's courage and one woman's faith will test what it truly means to believe in mercy. So tell me, how can a barren man and a shamed woman bring life to a dying town and make the whole frontier bow in awe? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The heavy snowfall muffled the usual clamor of Silvervale's main street. Arlo Boone adjusted his worn leather coat, its shoulders dusted white with fresh powder. His mule, Jenny, shifted beneath him, hooves crunching in the deepening snow. The late afternoon sky hung low and gray, promising more winter weather to come. Arlo's eyes narrowed as he surveyed the quiet mining town. Most folks had enough sense to be indoors on a day like this, a day when the cold could freeze a man's breath in his beard and make old injuries ache something fierce. His own leg, crushed in that cave-in 5 years back, throbbed with each step Jenny took. The general store's windows glowed warm against the gathering gloom. Arlo had his list of supplies memorized: coffee, flour, salt pork, ammunition. Everything a solitary man needed to wait out the winter in his mountain cabin. He'd timed this trip careful, knowing the passes would soon be choked with snow. As he dismounted, favoring his good leg, movement across the street caught his eye. A woman stood alone by the freight office, her figure substantial beneath a dress that had seen better days. One carpet bag sat at her feet, collecting snow. Something about her solitary presence made his chest tighten uncomfortable-like. The freight office door was already locked, its windows dark. Whatever stage or wagon the woman had hoped to catch was long gone. Arlo tried to focus on his own business, leading Jenny toward the hitching post. It wasn't his concern if some stranger had poor timing. A burst of rough laughter drew his attention back across the street. 3 miners had emerged from the saloon, their faces red with whiskey and cold. They'd spotted the woman, too. "Well, look what we got here," the tallest one called out. "Reckon that freight office gonna charge by the pound?" His companions guffawed, and Arlo's jaw clenched. He'd seen enough frontier cruelty to last a lifetime. The woman's shoulders hunched, but she kept her chin high, clutching her carpetbag closer. "Ain't you a sight?" another miner sneered. "Better hope them horses is strong." Arlo's hand tightened on Jenny's lead rope. The woman's face remained composed, though spots of color burned high on her cheeks. There was something dignified about her bearing that made the miner's taunts seem all the more base. The third miner opened his mouth, no doubt for another crude remark, but a sharp gust of wind cut through the street just then. It carried stinging pellets of sleet, driving the drunken men back toward the saloon's shelter. They disappeared inside, their laughter fading. The woman stayed where she was, snowflakes settling on her dark hair. As Arlo watched, she slowly lowered herself to her knees in the snow, her hands clasped together, head bowed. Her voice carried to him on the wind, clear and steady. "Lord, I ain't asking for much. Just someone who don't mind ugly. Someone who might see past what others can't." Something shifted in Arlo's chest, like ice breaking up on a spring creek. He'd tried to leave Faith behind after Sarah died, after the mine took his future. But this woman's simple prayer struck him like a physical blow. The sky was darkening rapidly now. Night would bring deadly cold, and she had nowhere to go. Arlo knew what it was to be marked by misfortune, to have folks look past you like you weren't quite human anymore. Before he could think better of it, he was leading Jenny across the street. His boots left deep prints in the fresh snow. The woman looked up at his approach, her eyes wary but steady. "Ma'am," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "Storm's coming hard. My cabin's up the mountain a ways. It ain't much, but you're welcome to shelter there tonight." She studied him for a long moment, weighing his words. "I'm Rhea June Talley," she said finally, "and I'm much obliged for the offer, Mr. Boone, Arlo Boone." He shifted uncomfortably. "Got a blanket here and Jenny can carry you. Trail gets steep in places." Rhea rose carefully to her feet, brushing snow from her skirts. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," she said softly, more to herself than to him. Arlo helped her mount Jenny, trying to be as gentle as his calloused hands would allow. He arranged the wool blanket around her shoulders, noting how she accepted his help without flinching or apologizing for her size. There was strength in that, he reckoned. The sleet was falling steadily now as they started up the trail. Arlo walked beside Jenny, one hand on her bridle. His bad leg protested each step, but he set his jaw against the pain. The darkness gathered quickly under the storm-heavy sky. Rhea sat straight in the saddle, the blanket pulled close. She didn't complain about the cold or the rough trail, though Arlo knew the journey couldn't be comfortable. Every so often he glanced up to check on her, finding her gaze fixed ahead with quiet determination. The wind picked up as they climbed higher, driving the sleet sideways. Arlo's coat grew stiff with ice. Jenny plodded steadily onward, steam rising from her flanks. The familiar landmarks of the trail were barely visible through the swirling white. "Not much further now," Arlo called over his shoulder, more words than he'd spoken to another person in months. Rhea nodded, her face pale but composed. The cabin finally emerged from the gloom, a dark shape against the snowy hillside. Smoke still rose from the chimney. He'd banked the fire before leaving that morning. Arlo felt a moment's self-consciousness about the sparse accommodations. One room, rough-hewn furniture, pelts drying on the walls. But it was warm and dry, and right now that's what mattered most. He helped Rhea dismount, noting how she bit her lip against a small sound of pain. The cold had likely stiffened her joints, something fierce. Her carpetbag was crusted with ice when he lifted it from Jenny's back. "Need to see to the mule first," he said, gesturing toward the cabin door. "Fire's lit inside. Make yourself comfortable as you can." Rhea nodded, fumbling slightly with the latch through cold, numbed fingers. "Thank you, Mr. Boone. Truly." Arlo led Jenny to the lean-to shelter beside the cabin, working quickly to remove her tack and rub her down. His thoughts kept straying to the woman he'd brought home, like a stone in his boot he couldn't shake loose. He'd grown used to silence, to answering to no one but himself. Yet something about her quiet dignity, her determination in the face of cruelty, had stirred memories he'd thought long buried. When he finally stepped into the cabin, stamping snow from his boots, he found Rhea kneeling by the hearth. She'd added a log to the fire, and the flames cast warm light across her features. Her hands were extended toward the heat, and her eyes were closed in what looked like prayer. Arlo moved carefully around her to hang his coat by the door. "Ain't much for supper," he said gruffly, "but there's beans and coffee if you're hungry." She opened her eyes and smiled slightly. "I'd be grateful for anything hot, Mr. Boone, and perhaps—" She hesitated, then continued with quiet dignity. "Perhaps you'd allow me to cook for us tomorrow. It's the least I can do to repay your kindness." Arlo felt that strange shift in his chest again, like something long frozen beginning to thaw. "Reckon that'd be fine," he managed, and busied himself with the coffee pot to hide his discomfort. Outside, The storm howled against the cabin walls, but inside, the fire crackled steadily, and the silence between them was no longer quite so empty. Arlo couldn't have said why he'd stopped to help this woman, why her simple prayer had pierced the armor he'd built around himself. But as he watched her warming herself by his hearth, he felt the first stirring of something he'd thought dead and buried. The possibility that God hadn't finished with him yet, that there might still be purpose in his broken life. The coffee pot began to bubble, and Arlo reached for 2 tin cups. Whatever tomorrow might bring, they'd weather this night together. 2 lonely souls finding unexpected shelter from the storm. The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney. Outside, the wind continued its mournful song through the pines. But within the cabin's rough walls, something new had begun. Though neither of them yet knew just how this night would change both their lives forever. The mountain trail grew treacherous as midnight approached. Snow had given way to ice, forcing Arlo to guide Jenny with extra care around the switchbacks. Rhea clung to the saddle, her breath visible in the frozen air. The moon, when it broke through the clouds, cast enough light to make the frost sparkle like scattered diamonds. "Almost there," Arlo called out, his voice barely carrying over the wind. Through the trees, his cabin finally emerged, a solid shadow against the starlit snow. Smoke still curled from the chimney, though the fire would be nothing but embers by now. Jenny's hooves crunched through the crusty snow as they approached. Arlo helped Rhea dismount, noting how she tried to mask her stiffness from the long ride. Her carpet bag had frozen solid during their journey. "Let me see to Jenny," he said, nodding toward the cabin door. "Fire needs tending. Kindling's beside the hearth." Rhea didn't argue, making her way carefully across the icy ground. The door creaked as she disappeared inside. Arlo led Jenny to the lean-to, working quickly to remove her tack and rub her down. The routine was familiar, but his thoughts kept straying to the stranger in his home. It had been 3 years since anyone but him had crossed that threshold. When he entered the cabin, stamping snow from his boots, he stopped short. Rhea knelt by the hearth, carefully arranging kindling around the remaining coals. Her movements were sure and practiced, showing none of the awkwardness he'd expected. Within moments, small flames began licking at the dry pine needles. "You know your way around a fire," he said, surprised into comment. She glanced up, the firelight softening her features. "My papa taught all his children, boys and girls alike. Said you never know when such learning might save your life." She fed larger sticks into the growing flames. "Though I reckon you've saved mine tonight, Mr. Boone." Arlo hung his coat by the door, uncomfortable with her gratitude. "Just couldn't leave you there in the cold. Nothing more to it than that." The cabin was a single room, with a rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, and a narrow bed in the corner. Sarah's quilt still lay folded at its foot, untouched since the day she died. Arlo cleared his throat. "You take the bed. I'll sleep by the fire." "No." Rhea's voice was firm but gentle. "I won't put you out of your bed, Mr. Boone. The hearth suits me fine if you've got a spare blanket." Something in her tone told him arguing would be useless. I fetched a wool blanket from the chest, watching as she arranged her makeshift bed near the fire. There was a quiet dignity in how she managed, asking nothing more than what was offered. The night passed slowly. Arlo lay awake in his bed, listening to the wind and the soft sound of Rhea's breathing. The familiar shadows of his cabin seemed different somehow, as if her presence had shifted something fundamental in the air itself. Morning arrived with startling brightness, sun glinting off the new-fallen snow until it hurt the eyes. Arlo woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of movement by the hearth. Rhea had already stoked the fire and set water to boil. "Hope you don't mind," she said, seeing him stir. "Thought we could both use something hot this morning. Before he could respond, a howl echoed from the ridge behind the cabin. Arlo was on his feet instantly, reaching for his rifle. "Wolves," he said grimly. "Need to check the stock pen." The morning air bit deep as he stepped outside. Fresh tracks circled the pen where he kept 2 goats, but the rough-built fence had held. The wolves had moved on, leaving only their prints in the snow as testament to their midnight hunt. When he returned, Rhea was stirring a pot of cornmeal mush over the fire. The familiar breakfast somehow looked different in her capable hands. She'd found his small store of dried apples and added them to the pot, along with a pinch of precious cinnamon he'd forgotten he had. "Trapline needs mending," he said, settling at the table. "Storm likely brought down some branches." Rhea nodded, serving him a bowl that steamed in the cool air. "I saw some darning needed doing, if you don't mind me touching your things. Noticed a heap of socks by your chair last night." The morning passed in strange domesticity. Arlo worked outside, checking his traps and clearing fallen timber from the lines. Every so often, he'd catch the sound of hymns drifting through the cabin wall. Rhea's voice was clear and sweet, rising and falling with the familiar tunes as she worked at her mending. It was late afternoon when Hoofbeats announced a visitor. Tom Wheeler, who rode the mail circuit between mining camps, appeared through the trees leading his snow-dusted horse. "Boone," he called out, grinning beneath his frost-covered mustache. "Thought I might find you up here. Town's fair buzzing with talk about the mule man bringing home a woman." Arlo's jaw tightened. "Ain't their business, Tom." "Never said it was." Tom's eyes strayed to the cabin window, where lamplight had begun to glow. "But you know how folks talk. Ain't had such excitement since the spring flood took out Miller's Bridge." After Tom rode on, Arlo stood for a long moment in the gathering dusk. The cabin windows glowed warm against the purple shadows of evening, smoke rising straight and steady from the chimney. It looked like a home again, he realized with a jolt. Inside, Rhea had somehow transformed his usual supper of beans into something remarkable. The addition of wild onions and herbs he didn't know he had, along with golden biscuits that filled the cabin with their warm scent, made it feel like a proper meal. "I hope you don't mind," she said softly as they ate. "I found some flour at the back of your shelf. Seemed a shame not to use it." "No mind," he managed, surprised by how much he was enjoying the simple food. "Been a while since anyone cooked proper in this kitchen." A blush colored her cheeks. "Mr. Wheeler brought news from town, I expect." Arlo nodded, watching her face carefully. "Folks talking about you being here. If that troubles you—" "It's kind of you to worry," she interrupted gently. "But I've weathered worse than gossip, Mr. Boone. What matters is the mercy you showed a stranger. That's worth more than any idle talk." He shifted uncomfortably. Was just the Christian thing to do. "Yes," she agreed, her eyes warm. It was exactly that. Later, as Arlo banked the fire for the night, he glanced over to where Rhea knelt beside her blanket. Her hands were clasped, head bowed in prayer, the lamplight casting a soft glow around her figure. The sight stirred something in his chest, comfort at having another soul under his roof, mixed with a nagging sense of obligation. Decency demanded he offer her shelter through the winter, yet the thought of sharing his solitude for months ahead made him feel both trapped and strangely hopeful. He turned away, letting her finish her prayers in peace. The cabin felt different tonight, warmer somehow, despite the winter wind that whistled through the cracks. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled at the rising moon, but inside, the lamplight held steady against the gathering night. 3 days passed like molasses in winter. The morning dawned gray and cold, with fresh powder coating the mountain slopes. Arlo had just finished checking his trap lines when he heard the jingle of approaching harness bells. Pastor Josiah Grady's weathered wagon climbed the narrow trail, accompanied by Mrs. Beatrice Henderson and Mrs. Martha Whitfield perched stiffly on the seat beside him. Their presence, unannounced and unwelcome, made Arlo's stomach knot. Town busybodies never brought good news. He limped to meet them at the gate, noting how the two women's eyes darted toward the cabin smoke. Their thick wool shawls and pinched expressions spoke of both cold and judgment. "Brother Boone," Pastor Grady called out, setting the brake. His voice carried the weight of official business. "Need to have words, if you don't mind." Arlo helped the ladies down, though they barely acknowledged his assistance. Mrs. Henderson sniffed audibly, whether from the cold or disapproval wasn't clear. The small party trudged through the snow to the cabin door. Inside, Rhea stood by the stove, her hands twisted in her apron. She'd clearly heard them coming. "Pastor Grady, Mrs. Henderson, Mrs. Whitfield," she greeted softly, ducking her head. "There's coffee hot, if you'd like." "This isn't a social call, Miss Tally," Mrs. Henderson said, emphasizing the miss like it was something distasteful. They arranged themselves awkwardly around Arlo's small table. The pastor cleared his throat several times before speaking. "Brother Boone, we've come about a delicate matter. The town's been talking." "Town's always talking," Arlo growled. "Ain't there concern what happens up here?" Mrs. Whitfield's thin lips pressed tighter. "It becomes the town's concern when Christian propriety is at stake. A single woman living under a widower's roof. Well, it isn't right." "She needed shelter," Arlo said flatly. "Was I supposed to let her freeze?" "Your Christian charity does you credit," Pastor Grady said carefully. "But good intentions don't always prevent harmful consequences. There are rumors starting, Brother Boone. Unkind ones." Arlo's hands clenched under the table. He'd known this was coming, had dreaded it since Tom Wheeler's visit. The town's gossip mill never missed a chance to grind someone's reputation to dust. "Miss Tally's reputation is at risk," Mrs. Henderson declared, "and by extension the moral standing of our entire community. Something must be done." Pastor Grady leaned forward, his eyes kind but serious. "There's really only one solution that will satisfy propriety and protect both your good names. You need to marry." The word fell like a stone in the quiet cabin. Arlo shot to his feet, his chair scraping across the floor. "Now hold on." "It's the only way," Mrs. Whitfield cut in. "Unless Miss Tally would prefer to try her luck at the charity house in Denver." A small sound drew Arlo's attention to the stove. Rhea stood with her back to them, but he could see her shoulders shaking. Silent tears tracked down her cheeks, though she tried to hide them. The sight hit him like a physical blow. He'd rescued her from freezing only to have her face this impossible choice: marry a stranger or be cast out again. His own reluctance suddenly seemed selfish in the face of her distress. "I reckon," he said slowly, each word feeling like it was dragged from his throat. "If it's what needs doing." Pastor Grady nodded approvingly. "I brought my Bible and registry, just in case. We can perform the ceremony today." The next hour passed in a blur. The women helped Rhea smooth her hair and pin on a borrowed lace collar. Arlo changed his shirt and combed his beard. They gathered before the hearth, where fresh snow still dusted the stoop visible through the open door. "Dearly beloved," Pastor Grady began, his voice filling the small space. "We are gathered here in the sight of God." Arlo barely heard the familiar words. His eyes were fixed on Rhea's trembling hands, clasped tightly before her. She'd done nothing to deserve this forced choice, yet here she stood, accepting it with more grace than he could muster. When it came time for the vows, his voice emerged rough and uncertain. "I, Arlo Boone, take thee, Rhea." "June Tally?" Her response was barely above a whisper, but clear. "I, Rhea June Tally, take thee, Arlo Boone." The ring was his first wife's, retrieved from the trunk where he'd stored away his memories. It hung loose on Rhea's finger, but she touched it gently, as if understanding its significance. "By the power vested in me," Pastor Grady concluded, "I now pronounce you man and wife. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." Mrs. Henderson produced a small cake she'd brought, and Mrs. Whitfield insisted on serving it with coffee. The forced celebration felt hollow, like play acting at happiness neither bride nor groom could feel. Finally, mercifully, the visitors prepared to leave. Pastor Grady pulled Arlo aside while the women helped Rhea wash up. "I know this isn't what either of you would have chosen," the pastor said quietly, "but marriage can grow into something beautiful, given time and effort. Remember that." Arlo just nodded, unable to find words. He watched the wagon disappear down the trail, taking with it any chance of returning to his solitary life. Inside, Rhea had already begun preparing supper. The familiar domestic sounds, potato peeling, wood shifting in the stove, seemed different now, weighted with new meaning. "I'll need to fetch more water," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "The bucket's running low." "I'll get it." Arlo grabbed the pail, grateful for any excuse to escape the cabin's suddenly confining walls. At the creek, he stared at his reflection in the icy water. A married man again, but not by choice or love. The weight of responsibility settled heavy on his shoulders. Supper was boiled potatoes with salt, eaten in awkward silence. They spoke only of practical things. Wood needed splitting, clothes wanted washing, trap lines required checking. "I'll sleep in the barn loft," Arlo said finally, unable to bear the tension any longer. "Plenty warm enough with extra blankets." Relief flickered across Rhea's face, though she tried to hide it. "You don't have to." "I want to," he said firmly. "It's right close, if you need anything." After he left, Rhea sat alone in the cabin that was now legally her home. She took out her mother's Bible, one of the few possessions she'd brought in her carpet bag. Opening to the blank pages in back, she dipped her pen in ink and wrote carefully, "January 15th, 1878. Married today. Not loved, but safe." The words stared back at her, stark and honest. Outside, coyotes began their evening chorus, their wild voices echoing across the snowy peaks. Inside, the lamp burned low as Rhea knelt for her evening prayers, asking God to guide them through this strange new path neither had expected to walk. The night settled deep around the cabin. In the barn loft, Arlo lay awake, listening to the coyotes and wondering what tomorrow would bring. Below him, his mule shifted in its stall, its movements familiar and comforting. The sound of distant howling carried on the wind, while, closer at hand, smoke curled from the cabin chimney, where his new wife kept her own solitary vigil. They were married now, bound by law and God's witness, yet separated by more than the few yards between cabin and barn. As the coyotes sang their lonesome songs to the stars, two people who were now husband and wife lay awake in their separate spaces, each wondering if they'd done the right thing, each hoping that safety might somehow, someday, turn into something more. February settled hard across the Colorado mountains, bringing the kind of cold that turned breath to ice and made timber crack like gunshots in the night. The snow packed dense and crisp, transforming the landscape into a world of white, broken only by the dark shapes of pine trees and the thin thread of smoke from the Boone cabin's chimney. Inside, life fell into careful rhythms. Each morning, Rhea rose before dawn to kindle the fire and set coffee boiling. Arlo would emerge from the barn loft, stamping snow from his boots, to find a hot breakfast waiting. They spoke little during these early hours, but the silence grew less strained as days passed. One bitter morning, Rhea watched through the window as Arlo wrestled with a fallen pine. His axe rose and fell in steady strokes, sending chips of wood flying across the snow. She'd learned to read his moods in the way he worked. Today's methodical pace meant his leg wasn't troubling him too badly. The woodpile grew steadily higher under his attention. Rhea had insisted on helping stack the split logs, though Arlo had protested at first. "Ain't proper work for a woman," he'd grumbled. "Proper work is what needs doing," she'd answered firmly, already gathering an armload of wood. After that, he'd stopped arguing, their days filled with the endless tasks of survival. Arlo spent long hours checking his trap lines, bringing home rabbits and the occasional fox. Rhea learned to skin and clean the catches efficiently, waste nothing. She rendered fat for soap and candles, scraped hides for trading, and kept every scrap of fur for patching. The cabin itself flourished under her care. She'd discovered a talent for making do with little, turning even meager supplies into comfort. Old flour sacks became dish towels, worn blankets were cut and braided into rugs, and every tin can found new life as a container for dried herbs or seeds. One afternoon, Arlo returned early from his traps, his hands tucked awkwardly in his coat. Rhea knew something was wrong the moment she saw his face. "Let me see," she said, already reaching for her herb basket. "It's nothing," he muttered, but his fingers were white with frost when she gently pulled them from his pockets. "You'll lose these if we don't tend them proper," she scolded, leading him to the fire. From her stores, she brought out a jar of bear grease mixed with yarrow and willow bark, a remedy learned from her grandmother. Arlo hissed as she spread the warming salve across his frozen fingers. "Should have worn my thick gloves," he admitted. "Dropped one in the creek trying to free a trapped beaver." "The Lord gives us sense to come in from cold," Rhea said mildly, wrapping his hands in clean strips of muslin. "Best you mind using it." To her surprise, a ghost of a smile crossed his face. "Yes'm." The poultice worked its magic through the night. By morning, Arlo's fingers were red and sore, but saved from the worst of the frostbite. He flexed them carefully as Rhea changed the bandages. "Much obliged," he said quietly. "Reckon I'd be short a few fingers if not for your doctoring." Rhea ducked her head, pleased. "Just common knowledge is all." That evening, over a supper of rabbit stew and cornbread, something shifted in the air between them. Perhaps it was the lingering gratitude, or maybe just the comfort of warm food after a cold day. But Arlo seemed less distant than usual. As Rhea gathered the dishes, he cleared his throat. "Been meaning to tell you something," he said, staring into his coffee cup. About why I was living alone up here." She settled back in her chair, waiting. In their weeks together, she'd learned that Arlo's words came easier if given space to find their way out. "Was married before," he continued roughly. "Sarah was her name. We had plans for a family, but I was working the silver mines then. There was a cave-in." Rhea's hands tightened on her apron as he spoke. The mines had taken many lives in these mountains. Everyone knew that. "I survived, but..." His voice grew hoarse. "Doctor said the crushing damaged things inside. Said I'd never father children. Sarah took sick that winter. Fever took her before spring. Reckoned after that no woman would want a man who couldn't give her young'uns. So I came up here, learned trapping instead." The confession hung in the fire-lit air between them. Rhea could see the old pain etched in the lines of his face, the shame he still carried. "God still gives harvest after hail," she said softly, the words coming from some deep place of certainty inside her. "My mama used to say that when the storms would flatten our corn. Sometimes blessing comes in ways we don't expect." Arlo looked up sharply, something flickering in his eyes. But he said nothing, just nodded once and carried his cup to the wash basin. That night, his dreams were strange and vivid. He walked through the cabin, but it wasn't the quiet place he knew. Laughter echoed from corners, small feet pattered across wooden floors, and warmth filled every shadow. He woke in the barn loft with his heart aching, the phantom sounds still ringing in his ears. The next week brought need for supplies. The flour barrel was scraping bottom, and they'd run through most of the coffee. Arlo hitched the mule to his small sledge and made the treacherous journey down to Silvervale. The general store was warm and crowded, filled with the smell of tobacco and leather. As he gathered his supplies, he couldn't help overhearing the conversations around him. "Saw the mule man's sledge outside," one miner said to another. "Remember that fat girl he took up the mountain? $10 says she don't last till spring. 15 says she runs first thaw," his companion answered with a harsh laugh. "No woman that size could handle mountain living." Arlo's hands clenched on the flour sack he was lifting. He wanted to turn around, to show these men exactly what he thought of their betting. But violence would only make things worse for Rhea. Instead, he walked to the dry goods counter where Miss Patterson was arranging ribbons. His eyes fell on a soft blue length that reminded him of the morning sky over the peaks. "I'll take 2 yards of that," he said gruffly, pointing. Miss Patterson raised her eyebrows, but measured out the ribbon without comment. Arlo added it to his purchases, trying not to think too hard about why he was buying it. The journey home was slow, the sledge heavy with supplies. By the time he reached the cabin, evening was drawing in. Rhea met him at the door, helping to carry in the provisions. As she sorted through the packages, he thrust the small paper-wrapped ribbon toward her. "Thought maybe for your bonnet," he mumbled. "If you want it." Rhea unwrapped the package with careful fingers. When she saw the blue ribbon, tears welled in her eyes. "It's beautiful," she whispered, touching the silk length reverently. "But you didn't have to." "Wanted to," Arlo said shortly, suddenly unable to bear the gratitude in her face. He turned quickly and went to tend the mule, leaving her standing in the doorway with the ribbon shining in her hands like a piece of captured sky. That evening, as she sewed the ribbon carefully onto her faded bonnet, Rhea hummed one of her hymns. The familiar tune filled the cabin with a gentle peace that even Arlo couldn't help but feel. He sat in his chair by the fire, mending harness leather, and found himself thinking that maybe, just maybe, God's harvest could indeed come after hail. Outside, the February wind sang through the pines, and stars pierced the darkness like bright needles through black cloth. Inside, 2 people who had been brought together by necessity continued their careful dance of learning each other, finding that sometimes the best gifts come wrapped in unexpected packages. The March winds brought warmth to the mountains, melting snow into rushing streams that swelled the creek beyond its banks. Water thundered past the cabin day and night, its roar a constant companion as winter slowly released its grip on the high country. Rhea stood at the edge of her newly cleared garden patch, studying the dark soil she'd worked with a hoe. The ground near the cabin was rocky but rich, protected from the harshest winds by a stand of pines. She'd spent days picking stones and turning earth, determined to grow something green after the long white months. "Reckon these'll take," she murmured, reaching into her apron pocket for the bean seeds she'd saved from winter stores. The morning sun warmed her shoulders as she worked, making neat holes with a stick and dropping seeds one by one. Her quiet humming floated across the yard, bringing in the sheaves, a harvest hymn that seemed right for planting time. From his workshop corner of the barn, Arlo could hear her singing. He paused in his woodworking, watching through the open door as she moved along the rows. Something about the sight made his chest tight. Her careful movements, the way she blessed each seed with a touch before covering it with soil. She'd brought life to the cabin in small ways over the winter, and now she was coaxing it from the very ground. He turned back to his project, a cradle he was building for the Mackenzie family down in the valley. Their first baby was due in summer, and they'd traded a fine deer hide for the work. Arlo's hands moved surely over the wood, shaping the rockers with careful strokes of his plane. He'd always been good with such things, though he'd never had cause to build a cradle for his own use. "That's mighty fine work," Rhea said from the doorway, making him start. She'd finished her planting and come to call him for the midday meal, her face flushed from the sun. "Just a simple thing," he replied, running his hand along the smooth rail. "Reckon every baby needs a proper place to sleep." "It'll be a blessing to them," she said softly, touching the curved headboard. "You've got a gift for making beauty from raw wood." Arlo felt his ears grow warm at the praise. "Best wash up for dinner," he said gruffly, setting his tools aside. But as they walked to the cabin together, he found himself hoping the Mackenzies would appreciate the extra care he'd put into the cradle's details, the carved pine cones at the corners, the gentle sweep of the rockers that would make for easy soothing. The days lengthened, bringing more warmth and the first green shoots in Rhea's garden. She tended them like precious things, watering in the cool mornings and evenings, touching each tiny plant as if encouraging it to grow. It was during one such morning that everything changed. Arlo was mending fence near the barn when he heard the thud. He looked up to see Rhea crumpled beside the laundry line, the basket of wet clothes spilled around her. "Rhea!" He crossed the yard in long strides, heart hammering. She was already stirring when he reached her, trying to sit up. "I'm fine," she mumbled, though her face was pale as milk. "Just got dizzy for a moment." "You're not fine," he said firmly, lifting her despite her protests. "You're going straight to bed, and I'm riding for the doctor." "Not the doctor," she said, gripping his shirt. "Send for Mrs. Compton, the midwife. Please, Arlo, I think I know what this might be." Something in her voice made him look down sharply, but she'd closed her eyes, tears leaking from the corners. He carried her inside and settled her on their bed. No longer just his dead wife's bed, but theirs now, though he still slept in the barn. The ride to town was tense, his mind churning with possibilities, none of them good. Mrs. Compton, bless her, didn't waste time with questions. She packed her bag and mounted her own horse, following him back up the mountain trail. Arlo paced the cabin porch while the midwife examined Rhea, wearing a track in the weathered boards. When Mrs. Compton finally emerged, her face was a study in amazement. "Mr. Boone," she said carefully, "I need you to sit down for what I'm about to tell you." He remained standing, hands clenched at his sides. "What's wrong with her?" "Wrong?" Mrs. Compton shook her head slowly. "Sir, your wife is carrying children. More than one, by my reckoning of the heartbeats. I'd say at least 5, though such a thing is nearly unheard of." The world tilted sideways. Arlo gripped the porch rail, his knuckles white. "That's impossible," he said hoarsely. "The mining accident. The doctor said I couldn't." "I've been bringing babies into this world for 30 years, Mrs. Compton said firmly. "I know the signs. Your wife is carrying multiple children, and they're strong and healthy by all I can tell." A roaring filled Arlo's ears, like the spring flood made sound. 5 babies. Impossible babies. Which meant... He burst through the cabin door, rage and betrayal burning in his throat. Rhea sat propped against the pillows, her hands folded over her middle, her face tear-stained but calm. "Who was it?" he demanded, his voice shaking. "Who have you been with?" "No one," she whispered. "I swear on my mother's grave, Arlo. I've known no man but you." "Don't lie to me." His fist crashed against the wall, making the cups rattle on their shelf. "We both know I can't father children. The doctor said—" "Doctors don't know everything God knows," Rhea said quietly. She reached for her Bible on the bedside table, pressing it to her heart. "I swear on this holy book, Arlo Boone. I have been faithful to you in every way. These babies are yours, a miracle straight from heaven's hand." He stared at her, at the certainty in her face, the tears still falling but her gaze steady as mountain stone. The rage in him warred with something else, a wild, impossible hope that made his chest ache. "I can't," he choked out. I can't do this." He stormed from the cabin to the barn, throwing gear into his saddlebags with shaking hands. Behind him, he could hear Mrs. Compton's voice raised in protest, but he couldn't stay. Couldn't face the choice between believing in miracles or accepting betrayal. The mule protested being saddled so roughly, but Arlo swung up anyway, pointing the animal toward the high ridge. Thunder rolled in the distance as clouds gathered over the peaks, but he didn't care. He had to get away, had to think. He made it as far as Timber Ridge, where the trail wound along a cliff edge. Lightning split the sky, startlingly close, and the mule balked. In that bright moment, Arlo saw the path ahead, narrow, dangerous, falling away into shadow. Behind him lay the cabin, and Rhea. Rhea, who had never lied to him about anything, who prayed every night and worked every day and met scorn with gentle dignity, who looked at him with eyes clear as mountain streams, swearing on her Bible that she'd been faithful. Another crack of thunder, and the rain began to fall. Arlo wheeled the mule around, some decision crystallizing in his heart. He couldn't leave her alone, truth or lie. Whatever came, he had to see it through. The rain was falling hard when he reached the cabin. Mrs. Compton had gone, leaving a list of instructions and promises to return soon. Through the window, he could see Rhea sitting in her rocking chair, one hand on her Bible, the other curved protectively over her middle. He put the mule in the barn, but didn't go inside the cabin. Instead, he unrolled his bedding in the barn's doorway, where he could keep watch through the night. Sleep was long in coming, his mind turning over and over the possibility that God might work mysteries beyond his understanding. In the cabin, lamplight glowed steady and warm. Just before sleep took him, Arlo heard Rhea's voice raised in evening prayer, asking not for herself, but for his heart to find peace with whatever truth lay ahead. Word travels fast in mountain towns, carried on whispers like wind through pine needles. By Monday morning, Mrs. Compton's discretion proved no match for Silvervale's curiosity. The news of Rhea's condition spread from the general store to the saloon, from the telegraph office to the mining company boardroom. "5 babies, they say," muttered old Jim at the feed store, shaking his head. "Ain't natural if you ask me." Pastor Grady heard the talk and hurried through town, his coat flapping in the spring wind. He found knots of people gathered on corners, their faces a mix of scandal and fascination. At the mining office, he overheard the clerk telling new arrivals about that fat woman up at Boone's place and the strange goings-on. "Friends," the pastor called out, his voice carrying across the muddy street, "I must ask you all to show Christian charity. What happens in a family's home is their private matter." But even as he spoke, he saw the skeptical glances, the barely hidden smirks. Someone in the back called out, "Ain't nothing private about 5 babies, preacher." The town doctor, a thin man named Harrison who'd treated miners for 20 years, tried to quell the speculation with medical explanations. "Most likely just abnormal swelling," he announced importantly at the Mercantile. "These mountain women, living rough as they do, often develop peculiar conditions." But his words only fed the flames of gossip. By Wednesday, stories had grown wild as summer weeds. Some claimed Rhea had made a deal with spirits. Others whispered about traveling salesmen who'd passed through before winter. The crueler tongues suggested she'd been consorting with multiple men, though none dared say this where Arlo might hear. Arlo felt the weight of every stare, every sudden silence when he walked into the general store. The whispers followed him like shadows. Even the bank teller, usually chatty about the weather, could barely meet his eyes when he came to withdraw savings. That evening, he returned to the cabin to find Rhea sitting in her rocking chair, mending one of his shirts. Her face was calm, but he saw the redness around her eyes. "They're talking in town," she said softly, not looking up from her needlework. They are. Arlo's voice was rough as pine bark. He stood by the window, watching storm clouds gather over the peaks. Dr. Harrison says it's just swelling. We both know it ain't that. Her needle flashed in the lamplight, steady and sure. These are babies, Arlo. Living souls God has blessed us with. He turned to her then, his face shadowed. Blessed. They're calling you witch and worse down there, saying things that... He stopped, his hands clenching into fists. What people say don't change what's true. Rhea set aside her mending and met his gaze. But if my being here brings shame on you, I'll go. My sister Mary has that ranch east of here. She'd take me in, I expect. Arlo's throat tightened. The thought of her leaving twisted something in his chest, but the memory of those sneering faces in town, the whispered accusations. Maybe that would be best, he said finally, just until we know what this is. Rhea nodded, as if she'd expected this answer. I'll pack my things tonight. The next morning dawned gray and threatening. Arlo hitched the wagon while Rhea gathered her few possessions. The Bible, some clothes, the quilt she'd brought from home. He'd added extra blankets and a tarp in case of rain. Pastor Grady rode up as they were loading the last items. You don't have to do this, he said, looking between them with concern. The talk will die down. People will accept... No, Pastor, Rhea interrupted gently. They won't. Not here, not now. Sometimes the Lord leads us into the wilderness for a season. The pastor sighed heavily, but didn't argue. He helped Arlo arrange the wagon seat more comfortably, then prayed with them before they set out. The first drops of rain began to fall as they pulled away from the cabin. The 30 miles to Mary's ranch stretched long and silent. The steady drumming of rain on the wagon's canvas cover marked time like a distant heartbeat. Rhea sat straight-backed, despite the rough trail, one hand resting on her middle, the other holding tight to her Bible. Arlo kept his eyes on the road, fighting the urge to look at her, to speak, to try explaining the tangle of doubt and shame and wonder that kept him awake at night. They passed other travelers, who stared curiously at the couple. The massive, grim-faced man and his large wife, heading east in the rain. Each time, Arlo felt his jaw clench tighter, his shoulders hunch against their gazes. Near noon, they stopped to rest the horses. Rhea shared the bread and cheese she'd packed, but neither could eat much. The silence between them had grown too heavy, filled with all the things they couldn't say. The rain eased as they approached Mary's ranch in the late afternoon. The place was modest but well kept, a 2-story house, a barn, some cattle grazing in the distance. Mary came out on the porch when she heard the wagon, her expression guarded. So it's true then, she said, looking at her sister. The letter you sent wasn't just talk. It's true, Rhea answered quietly. All of it. Mary's lips tightened, but she nodded. Well, come on in then. You look done in. Arlo helped unload Rhea's things, carrying them to the small room Mary indicated upstairs. Each step felt like lead in his boots. When everything was settled, he stood awkwardly in the yard, his hat in his hands. Rhea came out to say goodbye. The setting sun caught her face, and for a moment, she looked almost luminous. I forgive your doubt, Arlo, she said softly. I know this ain't easy to believe. He stared at the ground, shame burning in his throat. I'm no good for miracles, Rhea. Never have been. Maybe this is God's way of showing me that. Or maybe it's his way of teaching you to believe in them again. She touched his arm lightly. I'll be praying for you. He couldn't answer, just nodded roughly, and climbed into the wagon. As he drove away, he caught a glimpse of her in the mirror, standing straight and strong in the yard, one hand raised in farewell, the other curved protectively over the miracle she carried. The weeks that followed stretched long and empty. Arlo threw himself into work, trapping and hunting from dawn to dusk, But the cabin felt hollow without Ria's hymns, without the smell of her cooking, or the soft sound of her prayers. He wrote to her, short letters that felt inadequate as soon as he sealed them. "Hope you're well," he'd write, or "Weather's fair here." Sometimes he'd add a few coins from his trapping money, knowing she'd need things for the babies, if they really were babies. Even now, he couldn't quite let himself believe. Mary wrote back sometimes, terse updates about Ria's condition. "Growing bigger every day," one letter said. "Still prays every night, though folks here ain't kind about it. Says she knows God sent these children special." The unkindness Mary mentioned ate at him. He imagined Ria enduring the same sort of cruel remarks she'd faced in Silvervale, but now without him there to glare people into silence. Yet her letters, when they came, never mentioned hardship. She wrote of the garden she'd started, of the sunsets over the eastern plains, of her continued prayers for him and the children she was certain God had given them. "I don't ask him to make people understand," she wrote in one letter, "just to give them peace about it, same as I'm asking for you. These little ones move now, Arlo. I feel them dancing, under my heart, like stars come down to earth. They're a miracle, plain and simple, and I won't deny that truth to make folks comfortable." Arlo read that letter a dozen times, sitting in the cabin as summer rain pattered on the roof. He thought of Ria's steadfast faith, her quiet strength in the face of mockery and doubt. She'd chosen exile rather than deny what she believed God had done, while he'd chosen to hide from both miracle and responsibility. The realization sat heavy in his chest as darkness fell and crickets began their evening song. Outside, the rain continued, steady as grace, steady as faith, steady as a woman's prayers in the night. Thunder rolled across the plains like God's own drumbeat. Ria stood at the window of her sister's ranch house, watching purple-black clouds mass on the horizon. Her hands rested on her enormous belly, feeling the restless movements within. The air felt heavy, charged with electricity that made her skin tingle. Mary bustled around the kitchen, casting worried glances at her sister. "Maybe you ought to lie down, Val. Storm's coming in fierce." "Can't rest," Ria murmured. "Something's different today." She winced as a sharp pain gripped her middle. The first fat drops of rain began to fall, striking the window pane like bullets. Lightning split the sky, followed instantly by a crack of thunder that rattled the dishes in their cupboards. Ria gasped, doubling over. "Mary!" Her voice was tight with pain. I think it's time." Mary dropped the pot she was holding. "Lord have mercy." She ran to the door, shouting for the ranch hands. "Tom, Jake, get to town fast as you can. Fetch Mrs. Compton." The two men burst into action, mounting their horses despite the intensifying storm. They galloped off into the gathering darkness, their forms quickly swallowed by sheets of rain. Inside, Mary helped Ria to the bedroom they'd prepared weeks ago. The room was simply furnished, a broad bed, a rocking chair, stacks of clean linens. Lightning flashed again, illuminating Ria's face as another contraction seized her. "These babies are coming quick," Mary fretted, helping her sister onto the bed. "Too quick. Mrs. Compton's a good 10 miles out." "The Lord will provide," Ria breathed through clenched teeth. "He's brought us this far." Hours crawled by. The storm raged outside, wind howling around the corners of the house like a wild thing. Mary paced between the bedroom and the window, straining to hear hoofbeats over the thunder. Ria's labor intensified, her prayers mixing with cries of pain. Near midnight, they heard horses in the yard. Mrs. Compton burst in, soaked to the skin, her medical bag clutched to her chest. The midwife took one look at Ria and began issuing orders. "Mary, we need more hot water. And lamps, every lamp you've got. This night's work needs light." The birth chamber soon glowed with the warm light of 6 oil lamps. Outside, the storm reached its peak. Thunder shook the walls so, Hard the windows rattled in their frames. Lightning turned night to day every few seconds. "Lord in heaven," Mrs. Compton whispered as she examined Rhea, "I feel there's more than one head presenting. Many more." Rhea gripped the bedposts, her face sheened with sweat. "I know," she gasped. "I felt them all along, God's precious gifts." The first baby arrived just as lightning struck a tree in the yard, splitting it with a tremendous crack. The infant's cry rose above the thunder, strong, defiant, alive. Mrs. Compton cleaned the tiny girl quickly, her experienced hands trembling slightly. "She's perfect," the midwife announced, "but there's another coming right behind." The second birth followed swiftly, then the third. Mary ran between helping Mrs. Compton and mopping Rhea's brow with cool cloths. The storm's fury seemed to match the intensity of the birth, as if heaven itself strained with Rhea's labor. The fourth baby arrived as a massive thunderclap shook the house to its foundations. Through it all, Rhea remained focused, her faith unwavering. Her prayers never ceased, though they sometimes dissolved into groans of effort. Dawn was breaking when the fifth and final infant made her appearance. As Mrs. Compton laid the last tiny girl in her mother's arms, the storm began to fade. Sunlight pierced the clouds, sending golden beams through the window. "5 babies," Mrs. Compton said, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. 5 perfect, healthy girls. In all my years of midwifing, I've never seen the like. This is God's work, plain as day. Rhea lay back against the pillows, exhausted but radiant. The 5 newborns were nestled around her like a living crown, each one distinct and beautiful. One had eyes the color of summer sky, another's were deep brown like rich earth. The third had a sprinkle of copper hair, while the fourth's was black as night. The fifth had a tiny birthmark shaped like a star on her shoulder. Hope, Rhea touched each tiny head in turn. Mercy, faith, justice, glory. She looked up at Mrs. Compton and Mary. The Lord gave me their names months ago, in a dream. Mary sat heavily in the rocking chair, overwhelmed. 5 nieces, 5 miracles. Word spread faster than morning light. By the time the sun cleared the horizon, the ranch yard was filling with neighbors. They came on horseback and in wagons, drawn by the incredible news. 5 babies born in one night, during the worst storm in years. The crowd grew as morning wore on. Some faces showed awe, others suspicion. Whispers flew like autumn leaves. Must be some trick to it? Mrs. Compton herself says it's God's doing. But her husband's barren, everyone knows that. The storm last night wasn't natural. 5 perfect babies, though. How do you argue with that? Mrs. Compton stood guard at the bedroom door, allowing only a few visitors at a time to peek in. Each person who emerged had the same stunned expression, the same speechless wonder. The babies were undeniably real, undeniably perfect, and undeniably different from each other. Inside the quiet bedroom, Rhea nursed her daughters one by one, marveling at their tiny fingers and rosebud mouths. She sang hymns softly, her voice still strong despite her ordeal. The babies seemed to listen, their eyes focusing on her face with uncanny awareness. Near noon, a rider from Silvervale arrived, lathered horse showing how fast he'd come. He carried messages from Pastor Grady and others, all demanding confirmation of the incredible news. Mrs. Compton wrote her reply with a steady hand. 5 healthy girl babies born to Rhea Boone during the night's storm. I witnessed their births and swear before God and man that this is his miracle. Come see for yourself if you doubt. She sealed the letter and handed it to the rider, who stared through the doorway at Rhea and her daughters before galloping back toward town. The news would reach Arlo before sunset. Rhea touched each small head again, praying her husband's heart would be opened by this visible proof of God's power. The day wore on. more visitors arrived. Mary organized the ranch hands' wives to cook food for the growing crowd. The babies slept and woke and nursed, showing no signs of the weakness often seen in multiple births. Each one was robust, with strong cries and firm grips. Mrs. Compton kept careful notes of every detail, knowing this birth would be discussed for generations. She wrote of the perfect timing of the deliveries, the strength of the mother, the distinct features of each child. Her final entry read simply, "I have attended births for 30 years. What I witnessed this night was beyond nature. I have seen the hand of God at work." The midwife stayed close to Rhea, watching for any complications, but the new mother seemed to grow stronger by the hour. Her faith had sustained her through the pregnancy and birth. Now it radiated from her like light as she tended her miraculous daughters. "God's ways ain't our ways," she told Mrs. Compton as the babies nursed. "But his purpose is always love. These little ones will show people that, if they've got eyes to see." The 5 tiny girls, born in storm and controversy, slept peacefully in their mother's arms, unaware that their very existence had transformed rumors into wonder and set their small community on edge. Their names, Hope, Mercy, Faith, Justice, and Glory, rang like bells of change across the Colorado frontier. Outside, the crowd in the ranch yard continued to grow as word spread further. Some came to marvel, some to judge, but none could deny the power of what they witnessed. 5 new lives, born of faith and storm, had arrived to challenge everything their world thought it knew about possibility and grace. 2 days after the miraculous births, Arlo stood in Hannigan's general store in Silvervale, his arms full of supplies. The usual Saturday crowd milled about, their whispers carrying through the dusty air like wasps. "Heard tell. The mule man's woman had her babies," someone muttered behind the seed bins. "5 of 'em," another voice added. "But that ain't the strange part." Arlo's shoulders tensed as he counted out coins for flour and coffee. His ears strained despite himself. "My cousin's wife was there," the first voice continued. "Says they're mixed-breed babes, each one different as can be. Dark hair, light hair, different eyes." The copper pennies clattered from Arlo's suddenly numb fingers. The implications hit him like a mine cave-in. His chest tightened with the same crushing pressure he'd felt years ago, trapped beneath tons of rock. "That'll be $2.43, Mr. Hannigan said, but Arlo barely heard him. Mixed-breed babies, different features. The townsfolk's suspicious glances suddenly made horrible sense. They thought Rhea had been with multiple men of different races. The shame and rage rose in his throat like bile. Without waiting for his change, Arlo stumbled out into the street. Thunder rumbled overhead as storm clouds gathered, matching his dark mood. He swung onto his mule, supplies forgotten, and spurred the animal hard toward the east trail. The storm caught him halfway to the ranch. Lightning split the sky as rain pounded against his hat and shoulders. The usually steady mule slipped in the mud, but Arlo drove them on. Each crack of thunder fed his fury. Each flash of lightning illuminated terrible images in his mind. By the time he reached the ranch, his clothes were soaked through, and his thoughts were as black as the storm-darkened sky. He dismounted in the muddy yard, barely noticing the cluster of wagons and horses sheltered under the barn eaves. Visitors were still coming and going, drawn by news of the miraculous births. Arlo burst through the front door, tracking mud and rain across Mary's clean floors. A young ranch hand tried to stop him, but one look at Arlo's face made the boy step aside. He found Rhea in the back bedroom, propped up in bed. She looked pale but peaceful, surrounded by tiny bundles in white blankets. Mrs. Compton dozed in a rocking chair nearby, worn out from 2 days of constant supervision. "Arlo!" Rhea's face lit up at the sight of him, then fell as she registered his stormy expression. "You came." Had to hear the talk in town, he growled, water dripping from his coat. About your different-looking babies? Mrs. Compton stirred at his tone, but didn't wake. Outside, thunder crashed close enough to rattle the windows. Come meet your daughters, Rhea said softly, her calm voice a stark contrast to his anger. She lifted one of the sleeping infants. This is Hope. Arlo stepped closer despite himself, fists clenched at his sides. The tiny girl in Rhea's arms had copper-colored hair, unusual but not impossible given his own mother's Irish roots. And here's Mercy, Rhea continued, gesturing to another bundle. This baby was awake, studying him with eyes that stopped his breath. Gray eyes, exactly like Sarah's had been. His late wife's eyes, staring out of this newborn's face. The rage drained from him so suddenly his knees gave way. He dropped heavily onto the bed, staring at the infant who carried his first wife's gaze. But how? He whispered. The same way the Lord made the first rainbow, Rhea answered, to show his promise and power. Tears began to roll down Arlo's weathered cheeks as he looked at each baby in turn. Faith had his own dark hair and strong chin. Justice's features echoed his grandmother's portrait. Glory's birthmark matched the one his sister had carried. They're mine, he choked out. They're really mine. Yours and mine and God's, Rhea confirmed. A miracle for all three of us. Arlo slid from the bed to his knees, great sobs racking his broad shoulders. I'm sorry, he gasped. So sorry for doubting, for leaving you alone, for not having faith. Rhea reached out to stroke his wet hair. You came back. That's what matters. Mrs. Compton woke then, taking in the scene with knowing eyes. She helped Arlo to his feet and handed him a clean blanket. These babies need their father, she said firmly, and their mother needs her husband. Time to take your family home. The storm had passed by the time they loaded the wagon the next morning. Arlo had spent the night in the barn, too ashamed to claim a proper bed, but unwilling to leave his family again. He'd used the sleepless hours to reinforce the wagon bed, building a canopy frame to stretch canvas over. Mary and the ranch wives helped pack provisions and bedding. Mrs. Compton insisted on accompanying them, riding her own horse alongside. The babies were nestled in padded baskets, 3 on one side of Rhea and 2 on the other, as she sat propped against cushions. We'll take it slow, Arlo promised, checking the traces one final time. Stop at every good camping spot to rest. The wagon train set out just as the sun cleared the horizon. The recent rain had left the air fresh and clean. Birds sang in the wet branches overhead as they followed the creek trail toward the mountains. Their first stop came at midday, where a tributary crossed their path. While the horses drank, Rhea nursed the babies one by one. Arlo watched in wonder as each infant suckled strongly, their tiny hands curling and uncurling against their mother's skin. They favor you when they're hungry, he said, managing a weak smile. Determined as mules. Rhea laughed, the first real laugh he'd heard from her in months. The sound warmed something inside him that had been cold for far too long. That evening, they made camp in a sheltered meadow. Mrs. Compton helped Rhea tend to the babies while Arlo built a fire and set up the canvas shelter. The flames cast dancing shadows as they ate a simple supper of beans and biscuits. Tell me about them, Arlo said as they sat beside the fire. About their birth. Rhea described the storm, the hours of labor, the perfect timing of each arrival. Her voice held no blame for his absence, only joy in the telling. When she spoke of naming them, Arlo noticed how each baby stirred at the sound of her chosen name. Hope, because she came first, leading the way, Rhea explained. Mercy, with your first wife's eyes, showing God's kindness. Faith, carrying your features, proving his promise. Justice, built strong like your family line. And glory, marked like your sister, completing his plan. Arlo reached out to touch each small head as she named them. "I reckon the Lord knew what he was about," he said slowly, "giving them pieces of my past to heal my heart." They broke camp at dawn the next day, continuing their careful journey. At each creek crossing, Arlo walked beside the wagon, leading the horses through safe channels. Every stop brought them closer together as a family, as he learned each baby's habits and needs. Hope liked to be held upright, watching the world. Mercy only settled when sung to. Faith needed frequent changing. Justice slept best when swaddled tight. Glory wouldn't nurse unless her siblings were near. Mrs. Compton shared her wisdom as they traveled, teaching them how to care for 5 infants at once. "The Lord doesn't give challenges without providing help," she reminded them. "These babies came with their own special ways of letting you know what they need." The mountain loomed closer with each passing hour. Arlo found himself pointing out landmarks to the babies, though they were far too young to understand. "That's where we'll get our water," he told them at one stop. "And over there's good hunting ground. Your mama's got a fine garden started up by the cabin." "They'll know every trail and tree before they can walk," Rhea predicted with a smile. The final leg of their journey began as false dawn lightened the sky. Arlo urged the horses carefully up the familiar switchbacks, every sense alert for danger. But the trail remained clear, as if swept clean for their passage. Just as true dawn broke over the peaks, they crested the last rise. The cabin stood waiting in its clearing, morning mist curling around the walls. Rhea gasped softly at the sight. "Welcome home," Arlo said, his voice rough with emotion. Mrs. Compton helped Rhea and the babies inside, while Arlo tended to the horses. When he entered the cabin, he found Rhea seated in his old rocker by the hearth. She had Glory at her breast, while the other 4 babies slept nearby in a nest of blankets. Watching them in the early morning light, Arlo felt the last of his doubt and shame fall away. This was right. This was where they belonged. He crossed to kneel beside Rhea's chair, one large hand gentle on Glory's downy head. "I mean to do right by you," he promised. "By all of you." "You already have," Rhea answered. "You came back to us. The rest will follow." Through the open door, sunrise painted the cabin's walls with gold. The 5 tiny girls slept peacefully in their mountain home, unaware of the journey that had brought them there, or the healing their very existence had begun. Mrs. Compton watched from beside the hearth, her experienced eyes taking in the scene. A family forged in miracle and redemption, brought together by faith stronger than doubt, by love more powerful than fear. God's handiwork, plain as day. The mountain autumn painted the aspens gold as life settled into rhythm at the Boone cabin. Arlo rose before dawn each morning, stoking the hearth fire before heading out to check his trap lines. He'd return to find Rhea already up, her quiet singing mixing with infant coos as she nursed 2 babies while keeping watch over the others. "You're like a mother hen with her chicks," he said one morning, hanging his coat by the door. The cabin smelled of coffee and fresh bread, warmth pushing back against the crisp morning air. "5 little ones need a schedule," Rhea replied, shifting hope to her other side while Faith waited her turn. "Otherwise we'd never get any rest at all." The babies had grown steadily through the late summer weeks, each developing her own personality. Hope remained the leader, first to smile, first to grab at bright objects. Mercy watched everything with serious gray eyes, while Faith kicked her legs energetically during every feeding. Justice slept deeply but woke hungry, and Glory never settled unless she could see her sisters nearby. Arlo had spent the past month expanding the cabin, adding a proper nursery onto the eastern wall. The sound of his axe and hammer filled the days as he shaped local pine into walls and floor joists. Each evening brought him closer to completion, and closer to truly accepting his role as father to 5 miracle daughters. "Reckon we'll need more room as they grow," he said, measuring boards for the nursery's final wall. "Might add another room come spring." He looked up at the sound of hoofbeats approaching. Henry Benally, their Navajo neighbor from the next valley over, rode into view leading a milk goat on a rope. The man's quiet friendship had proved invaluable over the past weeks, his knowledge of local plants and healing ways complementing Ria's own skills. "The kids are weaned," Henry called out, dismounting. "Thought your little ones might need the milk soon enough." He tied both horse and goat to the rail, then lifted a cloth-wrapped bundle from his saddlebag. "Brought more of that willow bark tea, too. Helps with the teething when it comes." Ria appeared in the doorway, Justice cradled in one arm. "You're a blessing, Henry Benally. Come in and warm yourself." Inside, Henry settled on a stool by the fire, accepting a cup of coffee. His dark eyes took in the changes to the cabin, new shelving along the walls, 5 wooden cradles arranged near the hearth, clean diapers hanging on lines strung in the corners. The once sparse home had transformed into a proper nursery. "My sister helped me make these," he said, unwrapping his bundle to reveal 5 tiny beaded bracelets. "One for each girl to mark them as friends to our people." Arlo watched as Ria carefully tied the bracelets around each tiny wrist. The colored beads caught the firelight, dancing like stars. Something tightened in his chest as he realized how far he'd come from his solitary trapping days, when he'd barely spoke to his neighbors, let alone accepted gifts for children he'd never dreamed of having. "Much obliged," he said gruffly, meaning more than just the bracelets. The days fell into pattern as autumn deepened. Ria nursed the babies in rotating pairs while singing hymns she composed for each child. Hope's songs spoke of leading the way, mercies of healing old wounds. Faith's melody carried promise, Justice's rang with strength, and Glory's lifted praise to heaven. Between trap runs, Arlo spent hours carving small toys, wooden horses and birds, tiny wagons that would one day roll across the cabin floor. He worked on them in the evenings, wood shavings curling at his feet while Ria wrote in her Bible's margins, recording each baby's daily changes. Word of the miracle brood spread through the mining camps. Curious visitors began appearing at the cabin, some riding miles out of their way just to glimpse the 5 identical cradles. Most brought small gifts, sacks of flour, bolts of cloth, jars of preserved fruit. Few stayed long, but all left changed by the sight of 5 healthy infants in a home that had once known only loss. "The Lord provides," Ria would say, adding each new donation to their winter stores. She never questioned who left the anonymous bundles that sometimes appeared on their stoop. Boots sized for growing girls, warm shawls, bags of sugar tied with ribbon. Henry visited regularly, bringing news from other valleys along with his practical gifts. He taught Arlo how to build a proper goat pen and showed Ria which local plants could be dried for medicine. His quiet presence bridged worlds that had once seemed impossibly far apart. One evening, as they sat sharing coffee while the babies slept, Henry spoke of his people's beliefs about children. 5 births at once, that's powerful medicine, he said. In our stories, multiple births mean multiple blessings. These little ones will grow to help many people. Arlo nodded, watching the firelight play across his daughters' sleeping faces. "Reckon they're already helping. Teaching me about faith, for one thing. And teaching others about acceptance," Henry added. "I've seen how the miners look at my people differently now, since they started visiting here. Your family builds bridges without even trying." The truth of those words struck Arlo deeply. He thought of his own past prejudices, the walls he'd built around his heart after losing his first wife. Now here he sat, sharing his hearth with a Navajo neighbor while 5 miracle daughters slept nearby. The Lord did indeed work in mysterious ways. October painted the mountains in flame colors before giving way to November's steel skies. The first snow fell soft and silent, blanketing the cabin's new addition in white. Arlo stood in the doorway, watching it drift down, one of the wooden horses he'd carved turning slowly in his rough hands. Inside, Rhea moved between the cradles, humming softly. She paused in her evening routine to kneel beside the hearth, hands clasped in prayer. Her whispered words carried clearly in the hushed cabin. "Thank you, Lord, for this harvest of grace, for 5 new lives where we thought none could grow, for neighbors becoming family, for faith restored through your infinite mercy, and most of all, for bringing love back to this mountain home." Arlo felt his throat tighten as he watched her. The cabin that had once echoed with his solitary footsteps now overflow with life. Infant gurgles, soft singing, the creak of wooden cradles, the quiet conversations of true friendship. Each sound a reminder of blessings he'd never thought to receive. Henry's horse nickered from the shelter of the new barn, answered by the gentle bleat of the milk goat. Even the animals had found their place in this expanding family. The snow continued falling, wrapping the mountain in peaceful white, while inside the cabin, 5 miracle daughters slept soundly in their handcrafted cradles, their tiny wrists adorned with beaded bracelets that bridged 2 worlds. The first winter with 5 babies would bring challenges, Arlo knew. But looking at his wife's bowed head, listening to his daughter's soft breathing, feeling the presence of friends like Henry who had become as close as kin, he felt ready to face whatever lay ahead. God's grace had led them this far. It would see them through. The story of the Boone quintuplets spread like wildfire across 3 counties. What began as whispers in mining camps swelled into legend carried by every passing rider. Tales of 5 perfect babies born to a barren couple high in the Colorado mountains drew the desperate and the curious alike. They came first in 1s and 2s, women clutching rag-wrapped babies, men leading hollow-eyed wives on tired horses. Soon, entire families arrived in creaking wagons, their hopeful faces turned toward the mountain cabin like flowers seeking sun. Arlo watched them from the porch one morning, counting 5 new wagons circled in the valley below. The spring grass was trampled to mud around their wheels. Smoke from their breakfast fires curled up through the dawn mist. "More coming," he said, taking a cup of coffee from Rhea's outstretched hand. "Reckon we ought to put up a sign pointing to the creek for water." Rhea nodded, adjusting Faith against her shoulder. "And perhaps some benches under the big pine. Folks get tired standing through prayers." The visitors brought their burdens up the trail each day. Twisted limbs, fever-bright eyes, empty arms aching for children. They came seeking miracles like the one that had blessed the Boones. Rhea received them all with gentle grace, listening to their stories, offering what comfort she could. "I can't promise miracles," she would tell them, her own miracle daughters sleeping peacefully in their cradles. "But I know the power of prayer, and I know God sees every tear you cry." She insisted on feeding anyone who made the journey, sharing whatever their kitchen held. The iron pot on the stove never seemed to empty, though Arlo couldn't figure how she stretched their stores to feed so many. Their yard became a gathering place, with Henry Benelli's rough-hewn benches arranged in rows beneath the towering pine. Word reached Pastor Grady in Silvervale. He rode up one Sunday morning, his saddlebags bulging with Bibles, to find 30 people waiting in the Boone's yard. "Sister Rhea," he called out, dismounting, "I believe the Lord is calling us to minister here. Would you object to regular Sunday meetings?" Rhea smiled, bouncing glory on her hip. "This ground belongs to God first, Pastor. We're just tending it for Him." So began the mountain revival. Every Sunday, Pastor Grady led services under the pine tree. Hymns echoed off the ridges while Rhea moved through the crowd with the babies, letting desperate mothers touch their tiny hands in blessing. Arlo built more benches as the congregation grew. The miracle drew others besides the suffering. Henry's people came from their scattered camps, bringing gifts of woven blankets and dried herbs. Chinese railroad workers trudged up from their work camps, adding their voices to the hymns in their own tongue. Mexican vaqueros from the southern ranches arrived leading pack horses loaded with dried beans and corn. Not everyone welcomed the changes. Merchants in Silvervale grumbled about idlers and mixed bloods cluttering the streets on supply runs. Some of the older mining families stopped speaking to the Boones at all. "Ain't natural," Arlo overheard one man say at the general store. "Drawing all kinds of foreign folk up there. Mark my words, no good'll come of it." The words stung, but Arlo thought of Henry's steady friendship, of the Chinese men who'd helped him raise the nursery walls, of the Mexican grandmother who'd shown Rhea how to soothe colicky babies with mint tea. He loaded his supplies and rode home in silence, pondering how God's grace knew no borders. The steady stream of visitors strained their resources. One night, after the last seeker had descended the trail, Arlo took stock of their dwindling stores. The root cellar echoed with emptiness. Only a few wrinkled potatoes and 3 jars of preserved peaches remained. The flour barrel held barely enough for a week's baking. He found Rhea in the nursery, singing softly to mercy and justice. "We can't keep feeding everyone," he said quietly. "We'll starve ourselves come winter." Rhea looked up, her eyes peaceful in the lamplight. "You can't outgive God, Arlo. He'll provide." "Ain't about faith," he protested. "It's simple numbers. 5 babies to feed, plus ourselves, plus 20 or 30 extra mouths each day. No farm could sustain that." She rose, laying the sleeping infants in their cradles. "Remember the widow's oil in Scripture? How it never ran dry as long as she kept pouring? That's faith in action, dear husband. We pour out what we have, trusting God to refill the vessel." Arlo wanted to argue, but just then Hope began fussing. As he lifted his daughter, breathing in her sweet milk scent, he remembered his own miracle. These 5 lives that shouldn't exist, yet did. Perhaps Rhea was right about faith. That night they lay in their bed, listening to the soft symphony of 5 breathing babies. Through the open window came the distant sound of hymn singing, visitors in the valley below, lifting their voices in evening prayer. The sound floated up like incense, wrapping the cabin in melody. "Listen," Rhea whispered. "That's Amazing Grace in 3 languages." Arlo listened to the harmonizing voices, English, Chinese, and Spanish twining together in the darkness. The song spoke of being lost, then found, blind, then seeing. He thought of his own journey from bitter solitude to this moment, surrounded by new life and unlikely fellowship. "Reckon I'm still learning about grace," he said softly. Rhea's hand found his in the darkness. "We all are, dear husband. We all are." In the nursery, their daughters slept peacefully, unaware of the hope they represented to so many. The hymn singing continued, drifting up through the pine branches like a prayer. Inside and out, the mountain night was filled with the music of faith. Beyond the cabin walls, dozens of campfires winked in the valley, each flame marking another seeker drawn by tales of the Boone miracle. They would come again tomorrow, bringing their burdens and their belief. And somehow, through God's grace and Rhea's unwavering faith, there would be enough. Enough food, enough strength, enough love to share with all who made the journey. The hymn faded into silence, leaving only the sound of soft infant breathing. Arlo tightened his grip on Rhea's hand, anchoring himself in the miracle of now. Whatever challenges tomorrow brought, they would face them together, trusting in provision larger than their own understanding. Winter's icy grip tightened around the mountain cabin as 1879 dawned. Snow drifts piled higher than Arlo's head, forcing him to tunnel paths between house and barn. Game grew scarce in the valley, pushing him deeper into the pass to check his trap lines. Inside the warm cabin, Rhea made do with dwindling supplies. She stretched their meals with extra water in the stews and saved every scrap of food for the 5 growing babies. Yet she never turned away the steady stream of visitors, especially the children who came seeking more than just miracles. "That's right, Sarah," she encouraged a miner's daughter as they sat by the hearth. "Sound it out slowly." The girl traced letters in a patch of spilled flour on the table, while other children watched, eager for their turn. Rhea had started teaching reading when she noticed how many of the visiting families couldn't read their own Bibles. Faith and hope dozed in their cradle nearby as justice, mercy, and glory played on a quilt by the fire. Their healthy cries and bright eyes drew constant wonder from visitors. 5 thriving babies born to a man thought barren. The clip-clop of hooves on the frozen trail announced a new arrival. Through the frosted window, Rhea saw an elegant black carriage drawn by matched bays, unusual for these mountains. A well-dressed man stepped down, his city boots unsuited for the snow. "Mrs. Boone?" He removed his hat, revealing graying temples. "I'm Dr. Silas Marin from Denver. I've come about your remarkable case." Rhea instinctively gathered her children closer. "What case would that be, sir?" "Why, your quintuplets, of course." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "A medical marvel. I've been corresponding with your midwife, Mrs. Compton. She's finally admitted the truth. She administered one of my experimental fertility serums during your pregnancy." "That's not true." Rhea's voice shook slightly. "These children are a gift from God, nothing more." "My dear woman, science explains what superstition cannot. Multiple births of this nature only occur through medical intervention." He pulled out a sheaf of papers. "I have documents proving my research predates your pregnancy. These children are living proof of my serum's success." "Mrs. Compton never gave me any medicine," Rhea insisted. "She only brought tea and liniment." "She may not have told you. Many test subjects weren't informed." He paused as several prominent town leaders appeared behind him. The bank president, the mine owner, even Pastor Grady looking uncomfortable. "Think of the opportunity," the banker urged. "Denver newspapers already want the story. Our town could become famous as a medical pioneer center." "These are my babies." Rhea gathered all 5 into her arms. "They're not test subjects." "I have contacts at the finest research hospitals," Dr. Marin continued smoothly. "They would be studied, documented, given the best care." "No." Rhea's voice grew stronger. "For this child I prayed, and the Lord has granted me my petition." 1 Samuel chapter 1, verse 27. "These children were granted by God, not your serum." The doctor's face hardened. "I was afraid you'd be difficult about this. Sheriff?" Sheriff Trenton stepped forward, holding up a document. "Got a warrant here, ma'am. Judge says them babies need to be examined by proper medical authorities to determine their origin." "You can't take them." Rhea backed toward the bedroom. "They're not property to be claimed." "The law says different." Dr. Marin nodded to the deputies. "Secure the infants. Carefully now." Just then, snow crunched under heavy boots. Arlo filled the doorway, his rifle cradled in one arm. "What's all this?" "Mr. Boone." The doctor turned smoothly. "We were just explaining to your wife about the legal necessity of— Ain't nothing legal about stealing babies." Arlo's voice was quiet, but carried like thunder. "Clear off my land." "This warrant," Sheriff Trenton began. "Don't care about your paper." Arlo stepped inside, positioning himself between the men and his family. "Any man lays a hand on my children answers to me." The deputies shifted uneasily, hands near their guns. Sheriff Trenton looked from the warrant to Arlo's stone face, then to Rhea, clutching her crying babies. "Now see here," Dr. Marin blustered. "You can't interfere with a legal—" Last warning. Arlo's rifle hadn't moved, but his meaning was clear. Get off my mountain. The silence stretched tight as a trap wire. Then Sheriff Trenton slowly folded the warrant. Come spring, there'll be proper hearing on this matter, he warned. You can't hide up here forever? Ain't hiding. Arlo's eyes were cold. Just protecting what's mine. One by one, the men filed out. Dr. Marin was last, pausing in the doorway. This isn't over, Mr. Boone. Progress can't be stopped by superstition and threats. Arlo held his ground until the carriage disappeared down the trail. Only then did he lower the rifle and turn to Rhea, who was trembling as she soothed their crying children. They're gone now, he said softly, gathering his family close. But they both knew this was just the beginning. Science and law had laid claim to their miracle, and the mountains themselves might not be high enough to keep their precious children safe. Gray clouds hung low over Silvervale, like a shroud the next morning. 2 deputies arrived at dawn with a wagon, its bed lined with straw. Rhea stood in the doorway, her 5 babies bundled against her chest, tears freezing on her cheeks. Please, she whispered. They're too young for town jail. Orders is orders, ma'am. The younger deputy wouldn't meet her eyes. Dr. Marin says they need proper observation. Arlo's mule had gone lame the previous evening, leaving them without transportation to fight this injustice. He stood helpless, watching as they loaded his family into the wagon like cargo. The sight of his wife climbing up, still weak from childbirth, made his hands clench into useless fists. I'll be right behind you, he promised. Soon as I tend the mule. Rhea nodded bravely, though her lip trembled. The Lord goes before us, she said softly, even into the valley of shadows. The wagon creaked away down the mountain trail, leaving Arlo alone in the silent yard. He checked the mule's swollen leg one last time, knowing it would be days before the animal could travel. Without waiting to pack provisions, he started walking. The journey that normally took 3 hours on horseback stretched into a grueling ordeal on foot. Ice-crusted rocks tore at his boots. The old mining injury in his leg screamed with every step. By midday, blisters formed and burst, leaving bloody tracks in the snow. Still, he pushed on. Through the afternoon, dark clouds gathered closer. Wind cut through his coat like knives. Yet the thought of his babies in that cold cell drove him forward. He remembered their tiny fingers, their trusting eyes. How could any man claim they weren't his own flesh and blood? Silvervale's church bells were ringing evening services when Arlo finally limped into town. A crowd had gathered outside the jailhouse, drawn by word of the miracle babies being held within. Some faces showed sympathy, but others wore cruel smirks. Well, if it ain't the barren man claiming God's brood, someone shouted. Laughter rippled through the crowd. Ain't natural, 5 at once, another voice called. Had to be some devil's work involved. Or some other man's work. This brought more laughter. Arlo pushed through them, his leg nearly buckling. Pastor Grady stood on the jailhouse steps, trying to calm the growing mob. Friends, neighbors, the pastor raised his hands. Let's show Christian charity here. These are innocent children. Them babies need proper scientific study, interrupted Dr. Marin, who stood smugly beside Sheriff Trenton. The law supports my claim to examine them. They need their mother's care, Arlo growled. Not your prodding and poking. From inside the jail came the sound that tore at his heart. 5 babies crying in unified distress. Through the barred window, he could see Rhea attempting to comfort them all at once, her face streaked with tears. Sheriff Trenton stepped forward, hand on his gun belt. Now, Boone, don't make this worse. Doctor's got his legal rights. Legal rights to steal children? Arlo's voice cracked. To cage them like animals? It's for the advancement of medical science, Dr. Marin said smoothly. Surely you want to know how this miracle occurred. I already know. Arlo's legs finally gave out. He sank to his knees in the muddy snow beneath the jail window. It was God's doing, His mercy on two lonely souls. The crowd grew quiet, shocked to hear such words from the notorious recluse. Arlo lifted his face to the iron bars where his family waited. "Lord," he prayed aloud, his voice carrying in the sudden silence. "I ain't talked to you proper since Martha died. Blamed you for taking her, for leaving me barren and bitter." His shoulders shook. "But you sent Rhea to teach me love again, sent these precious babies to heal my broken faith. I'm on my knees now, Lord, begging your help. Don't let them take our miracle." The bitter wind that had been building all day suddenly gusted through the street. It snatched Arlo's battered hat and carried it spinning up into the darkness. He remained kneeling, head bowed, as the first snowflakes began to fall. Through the window, his children's cries slowly quieted. Rhea's clear voice rose in their place, singing the hymn she'd written when they were born. 5 lights in the darkness, 5 stars in the night, 5 proofs of God's promise, 5 signs of His might. Dawn crept over Silvervale with a sickly gray light. Inside the jail cell, Baby Hope's forehead burned against Rhea's palm. One by one, each infant began to whimper with fever, their tiny faces flushed from the damp cell's chill. Dr. Marin pressed his hand to Justice's brow and stumbled back. "This is impossible. They were fine last night." His scientific confidence crumbled as Glory's cries grew weaker. "I can't treat 5 fevers at once." Word spread through town. Doors slammed shut as people hurried inside, fearing disease. The sheriff stood back, keys rattling nervously at his belt. Arlo didn't wait for permission. He shouldered past the doctor and kicked the cell door, splintering the lock. "Henry!" he called out the window. His Navajo friend appeared like a shadow, arms full of medicine bags. "Willowbark tea," Henry instructed, passing bundles through the bars. "And yarrow for the fever." Rhea's voice trembled but didn't break as she sang hymns, rocking mercy and faith. Arlo built a fire in the cell's small stove, heating water for herb tea and compresses. His big hands, gentled by love, bathed each baby's fevered skin. Through the bars, Sheriff Trenton watched the father he'd once mocked tend his children with fierce devotion. "Maybe heaven favors fools after all," he muttered, then unlocked the outer door to let Henry bring more supplies. Hour by hour, they fought the fever. Arlo didn't rest, moving from child to child with determined grace. Near midnight, Hope's fever broke first, followed by her sister's. When morning sun filtered through the barred windows, every prisoner in the jail joined Rhea's hymn of thanksgiving, their rough voices softened by wonder at the sight of 5 sleeping babies, safe in their parents' arms. Dr. Marin slumped against the jailhouse wall, his proud demeanor crumbling like salt. "I must confess something," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The serum I claimed, it was nothing but spring water from an underground source near Boone's cabin." The crowd gathered outside the jail fell silent. Pastor Grady stepped forward, his weathered face lighting with understanding. "The mountain spring. That's why so many pilgrims reported feeling better after visiting." "Natural healing salts in the water," Dr. Marin explained, shame coloring his words. "I discovered the aquifer while exploring the area. I thought I could use it to make my reputation." Sheriff Trenton unlocked the cell door with steady hands. "Reckon that means these folks are free to go. No fraud when the miracle's real, just coming from a different source than claimed." Rhea gathered her babies close, their faces still warm but peaceful. Arlo stood tall beside them, his eyes clear and certain. "The water belongs to everyone," he declared, his voice carrying across the morning air. "Any soul who needs healing can draw from it freely. That's God's way." The townsfolk pressed closer, many dropping to their knees in prayer. Even those who had doubted loudest bowed their heads, moved by grace larger than their understanding. Someone began to sing a hymn, the melody rising pure and strong. Above them, the church bells began to ring, their bronze voices echoing off the mountains. Each clear note seemed to proclaim the truth, that miracles could come wrapped in ordinary things, like spring water and a mother's love. Ria's fingers found Arlo's calloused hand and held tight. Together they stood in the morning light, surrounded by their restored community, 5 miracle babies, and the sound of bells calling all to worship. Summer breezes rustled through the expanded homestead as months rolled past like gentle clouds. Where Arlo's solitary cabin once stood, a sprawling mission school now welcomed all. Fresh-cut timber gleamed in the sunshine, testament to how former doubters had pitched in to raise new walls and hopes alike. Down by the creek, Arlo's newly built mill wheel turned steadily, grinding grain from fields now green with irrigation. The healing spring water, channeled through carefully dug ditches, had transformed the valley's dusty soil into fertile promise. The 5 miracle children, now sturdy toddlers, played in the schoolyard. Hope and Justice chased butterflies, while Faith helped a Navajo child stack wooden blocks. Mercy shared her cornbread with settler children, and Glory's laugh rang clear as mountain air. Their different eyes and features blended perfectly, like flowers in God's garden. Inside the schoolhouse, Ria's gentle voice guided students through their letters. Her own children had inspired her to teach others, turning the once quiet mountainside into a place of learning and light. Through the window, she could see Henry Benelli showing older boys how to mend harnesses, while his wife Sarah taught girls to weave. Wagons filled the meadow for the dedication gathering, their canvas tops bright against the grass. Hymns rose from hundreds of throats as Pastor Grady blessed the new well. The sound echoed off the mountains like angels singing. As sunset painted the sky in autumn gold, Arlo stood before the assembled crowd. His voice, once so reluctant to speak, carried clear and strong. "My wife," he said, looking at Ria with eyes full of pride, "gave this valley its heart back." The gathered people, once divided by suspicion, now nodded as one family, united in prosperity born of compassion and trust. 20 years painted the valley in changing seasons, each one bringing new blessings to count. The mission school had grown into a proper town, with the healing spring at its heart. Neat rows of houses spread along the creek where Arlo's lonely cabin once stood, and gardens bloomed where dust once ruled. On their wide wooden porch, Arlo and Ria Boone sat in matching rocking chairs, watching the life they'd helped create unfold before them. His hair had turned silver as mountain frost, while gentle lines marked her face like beloved scripture passages. They're joined. Hands spoke of decades sharing joys and sorrows. "Look there," Arlo whispered, his voice softer than it once was. He pointed with his free hand toward the schoolhouse, where their eldest, Hope, stood ringing the end-of-day bell. Her students poured out into the yard, a mix of settler and native children carrying slates and books. Hope had her mother's gift for nurturing spirits, teaching not just letters but understanding between peoples. "She's got 40 students now," Ria said proudly. "More coming next term." Near the creek, Mercy moved between the sick houses she'd helped establish. Her strong hands and gentle heart had saved countless lives, combining her mother's herbs with modern medicine. They watched her pause to comfort a worried mother, her own rounded belly promising another generation to come. The steady turning of the mill wheel marked where Faith kept her father's legacy strong. She'd learned every creak of the machinery, every secret of the grain. Under her care, the valley's wheat turned to flour that fed hundreds. Her husband, Tom, hauled sacks to waiting wagons while their children played in the flour dust. "There's Justice riding in," Arlo noted as their second youngest son appeared on the trail. His Apache wife, Morning Star, rode beside him, their 3 children secure in front of them on patient ponies. They'd built bridges between cultures that would last generations, proving love knew no boundaries. The church bells began their evening song, rung by Glory's steady hand. As the preacher's wife, she'd inherited her mother's faith and her father's strength, leading songs that lifted hearts to heaven. Her voice carried across the valley, clear as morning light. A winter breeze whispered through bare branches, carrying memories of that snowy night when a lonely trapper and an outcast woman first met. Rhea adjusted the quilt across their laps, noting how Arlo's breathing had grown shallow these past weeks. "Remember that first night?" he asked, his voice barely louder than the wind. "You kneeling in the snow, praying for someone who didn't mind ugly?" He squeezed her hand. "Weren't nothing ugly about your heart, though. Never was." "The mountain wrote us different," Rhea said softly, feeling tears gather. "Wrote us a story bigger than we could have dreamed." "We were barren once," Arlo murmured, watching their grandchildren play in the schoolyard. "But look at all this life." His eyes traced the valley, the houses, the gardens, the faces of people who'd found healing in the spring's waters and hope in their story. God sure has a way of turning empty to plenty. The first snowflakes began to fall, big and gentle as goose down. They settled on the porch rails just as they had that long-ago night when destiny wore a winter coat. Arlo's grip on Rhea's hand softened. "Reckon I saw my first miracle that night," he whispered. "You standing in the snow, refusing to break." His eyes, still that same clear gray that had captured her, heart met hers. "Every day since has been another one." The snow fell steadily now, blessing the valley with quiet. Glory's church bells rang the evening prayer as Arlo's breathing slowed, peaceful as a child drifting to sleep. Rhea felt his hand grow still in hers, but her tears held more gratitude than grief. "The mountain wrote us different," she whispered again, watching the snow transform the valley into a clean white page. Around her, life continued its sacred dance, hope gathering her students' mittens, mercy hurrying home to her family, faith closing the mill for the night, justice and Morning Star stabling their horses, Glory's hymn rising clear above it all. The evening star appeared through breaking clouds, bright as promise. Rhea sat holding Arlo's hand as darkness gentled the valley, knowing their story would be told as long as the spring flowed and children learned hope in the shadow of these mountains. The snow continued falling, each flake a letter in God's endless book of grace, writing new stories for new generations to read. Love had made them more than husband and wife. It had made them a beginning. Their barren ground had sprouted a forest of blessing, and though Arlo's chair would now stand empty, the life they'd built together would flow on like the healing spring, offering hope to all who thirsted. The mountain had indeed written them different, turning 2 outcasts into the heart of a community, proving that love's arithmetic could multiply joy beyond counting. As night drew its star-stitched blanket over the valley, Rhea smiled through her tears, grateful for every step of the path that had led them here. From that first snowy night to this peaceful goodbye, the mission bell tolled the hour, and in its echo, she heard 2 decades of prayers answered, battles won, hearts healed, and love proven stronger than doubt. Their 5 miracle children had grown into pillars of the community, their own families adding new chapters to the story that had begun with a simple act of mercy in the snow. Each snowflake falling now carried a memory. Arlo's first grudging kindness, their marriage of necessity that bloomed into deep love, the impossible joy of 5 babies, the fight to keep them, and the valley's transformation through faith and forgiveness. The mountain had taken Arlo home the same way it had brought him to her, in gentle falling snow, with bells ringing across the valley he'd helped bring to life. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.